Daenerys Targaryen began as a refugee princess sold into marriage. She grew into a liberator, rising to power, freeing slaves, conquering cities, all while earning dragons and loyal followers. Yet in the final episodes of Game of Thrones, she abruptly morphed into a ruthless tyrant, burning King's Landing and unjustly killing thousands. Fans felt betrayed, saying the writers destroyed what they loved. However, there are many reasons why trust from the audience collapsed. In storytelling theory, character arcs must move logically. A character can evolve, but each change should follow from prior actions, experiences, or beliefs. A sudden shift without proper build-up breaks the suspension of disbelief. It betrays the investment the audience has placed in the character. Daenerys was originally driven by justice, ending slavery, protecting innocent lives, refusing to harm civilians. That foundation made her heroic. As long as she acted within those moral constraints, fans stayed engaged. Foreshadowing is like planting little hints early in a story that something big will happen later. The payoff is when that big thing actually happens, and if it matches the earlier hints, it feels natural and makes sense, but if the story skips the setup and jumps straight to the big moment, it can feel random or forced. In Game of Thrones, critics said the show gave only vague clues that Daenerys might go mad. It didn't spend enough time showing her emotional struggle or building up to her final actions, so her sudden turn felt unearned. Daenerys' early arc featured both compassion and violence. Firstly, she liberates slaves in Slaver's Bay and exiles the guilty, but she always balances justice with mercy. Secondly, she loses loved ones including Khal Drogo, Jorah, and Missandei, yet she grieves and is shaped by these losses. Lastly, her decisions are dramatic but purposeful, especially burning the Masters in Astapor and the Tarryals after they refuse to kneel. These actions are contextualized as war or punishment. Critics like Andrew Prokop argued that these moments did foreshadow potential madness, but they also show that her cruelty remained directed and intentional. Daenerys questions her own impulses in the books, and she fears herself even before she claims power fully. The turning point can be seen in Season 8's episode, King's Landing Surrenders, Bells Ring. Instead of pausing, Daenerys orders Drogon to burn the city, targeting civilians with no resistance. The show cuts rapidly between scenes and characters, focusing less on Daenerys' inner chaos and more on collateral horror. The viewer doesn't see Daenerys' internal decision-making, only the devastation. In effect, she transforms from a complex character into death from above. Time magazine said the show rushed her downfall, removing coherent development to serve plot convenience and relied on harmful sexist stereotypes. Season 8 had too few episodes to accomplish this believably. According to the narrative, their arc collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Reddit hosted many raw fan reactions, reflecting emotional and logical frustration. One user acknowledged Daenerys' violent streak, arguing the turn would make sense, but that the writers did a poor job in executing it. Yet the same post also says it felt rushed and poorly handled. Another fan argued that Daenerys became an accessory to her own death. They felt the show ignored others' betrayals and focused only on her descent. While many people expressed deep disappointment, a close analysis of the story points at one thing. Season 8 compressed 2 seasons worth of story into 6 episodes. Character growth that might have taken seasons was squeezed into moments. Authors pointed out that all Daenerys' prior killings were in context. Enemy combatants were traitors. Burning civilians felt arbitrary and disconnected from her relatively principled violent history. Defenders claimed grief, betrayal, loss, but many characters lost as much and didn't snap that way. In that season, Daenerys isn't shown deciding or struggling. The show intentionally focused on victims, not the killer's mind. That removed empathy and made her actions feel directionless. Usually, powerful women who fail are portrayed as crazy or emotional. Cersei and Daenerys both fell in ways that many saw as sexist storytelling shortcuts. Moreover, Daenerys' advisors, including Tyrion, Jon, Missandei, and even the people of Westeros, were marginalized. After Missandei's death, her grief should have been visible in dialogue and decisions, but was barely touched on. Her advisors should have acted as moral counterweights, but the script erased these dynamics. In more nuanced storytelling, a character grappling with change should be held in tension by companions or internal moral conflict. Daenerys lacked such tension in the final episodes. Usually, if a character's emotional arc is confined to dialogue or flashbacks without visible process, the change lacks weight. Game of Thrones skipped internal scenes entirely. In classic structure, Season 8 skipped emotional seeds in favor of a rapid climax. The result had audience who didn't feel transition. They just witnessed chaos. If Daenerys had ascended to power earlier at the end of Season 7, Season 8 could have explored 4 different situations. Firstly, her paranoia as isolation grew. Secondly, the breakdowns in relationships with advisors. Thirdly, the moral debates internal to her character. And lastly, growing distrust among followers. This pacing would reflect a slow burn, giving viewers time to process her choices. Instead, the arc skipped from grieving Missandei to mass genocide in 2 episodes without any transition. When a beloved character behaves in ways the audience finds inexplicable, trust evaporates. Fans stop caring about their choices. They feel cheated, and even if the seeds were there, payoff felt dishonest. At some point, fans began petitioning to remake the final season with over 1.8 million signatures because they believed showrunners had abandoned the narrative integrity they had built for years. Some critics like Vox's Andrew Prokop argued that Daenerys' arc toward madness might have always been part of a Song of Ice and Fire, a tragic symmetry with her father, the Mad King. They saw parallels, such as the crucifixions on Mirian, or the fear of power corrupting her mercy, but they also concur that the execution was flawed. It lacked the emotional scaffolding to make the turn meaningful, reducing tragedy to shock. To understand what went wrong with Daenerys' arc in Game of Thrones, we need to look at some basic rules of good storytelling and how the show ended up breaking them one by one. First, great stories show characters changing step by step. If someone turns into a villain, we should see how and why it happens over time. But in Game of Thrones, Daenerys went from being a hero fighting for justice and freedom to suddenly burning a city full of innocent people. It happened almost overnight, with barely any warning. Second, when characters go through loss or trauma, we need to see how it affects them on the inside. That's how we understand their decisions. After Missandei's death, Daenerys could have had moments of grief, doubt, and emotional breakdown, but the show didn't give her that space. Instead of seeing her thoughts or feelings, we only saw how others reacted to her. As a result, we were left guessing what was going on in her head, and the big choices she made didn't feel believable. Third, side characters challenge the hero. They question decisions, offer different views, or act as a voice of reason. That tension helps guide or even stop a hero from going too far, but in Season 8, Daenerys' closest allies barely pushed back. Her advisors were either ignored, killed, or written as weak. There was no real push and pull, no meaningful conversation to help us understand her state of mind. That silence made her fall feel isolated and flat. One of the best things about Game of Thrones was its moral complexity. Characters weren't purely good or evil, they lived in the gray, but when Daenerys snapped, the story suddenly painted her as completely evil. She wasn't struggling with right or wrong anymore, she just became the bad guy. This shift erased all the stages that made her character interesting. Fans felt cheated, like the writers had taken a shortcut instead of giving her a complex emotional ending. Meanwhile, big character changes need time to develop, but Season 8 rushed through everything. The final episodes were packed with action, major twists, and dramatic moments, but there was no room for emotional depth. Daenerys' downfall was crammed into a couple of episodes when it really needed a full season to make sense. Without that time, her choices felt forced. So what went wrong? The writers sacrificed character for plot expediency. They refused to invest in internal conflict, trust from advisors, or gradual erosion. They leaned on familiar tropes, ignoring fresh complexity. They forgot that audience trust is earned through consistency. Daenerys' turn may have been intended as tragic symmetry or a commentary on power, but without careful build-up, it felt like a betrayal. Another big reason Daenerys' shift felt so wrong is because it clashed tonally and culturally with the Westeros she was supposed to rule. Throughout Game of Thrones, Westeros is depicted as a land of political chess, subtle manipulation, family legacy, and tradition. Daenerys, meanwhile, was shaped by Essos, where might often made right, and power was expressed through spectacle, dragons, slave revolts, fire, and blood. Her power base in Essos was built on freeing the oppressed. The people followed her because they wanted to, but when she arrives in Westeros, she's treated like a foreign invader, not a liberator. She has no real connection to the common people. No nobles champion her cause. She's met with suspicion by the North, open hostility by Cersei's allies, and even distance from Jon Snow. However, the show did not do enough to explore how this cultural and social dissonance might isolate Daenerys, radicalize her thinking, or convince her that fear is more reliable than love. Instead, we are told in passing that no one loves her here, and that's enough to make her snap. A richer story would show Daenerys trying and failing to build trust in Westeros, and then emotionally unraveling over time. Instead, her disconnection is treated as a plot device. Another key aspect that was undercooked was her relationship with Jon Snow, aka Aegon Targaryen. The revelation that Jon had a more legitimate claim to the throne could have been a brilliant opportunity for emotional complexity, jealousy, fear of betrayal, abandonment, and a sense of being used. In Season 8, we see flickers of this. She asks Jon not to tell anyone about his lineage. When he refuses, she feels deeply betrayed. But instead of continuing to explore the hurt or paranoia that might build over episodes, we get a handful of short scenes and then a massive heel turn into tyranny. This is important because Jon was supposed to be her moral anchor. His rejection could have been the breaking point, but the show doesn't give that moment emotional space. There's no real fallout between them, no passionate argument, no screaming, no real mourning of the love that once was. Jon simply stands silently as Daenerys lost herself completely. A better version of the story would show Daenerys torn between love and ambition, idealism and betrayal. Instead, that internal war is replaced with cold silence, and the emotional implosion is left for the audience to guess at. The role of Varys in the last season is another opportunity to showcase Daenerys' slow descent into tyranny. Varys has always been a realist, someone who chooses stability over loyalty. When he begins plotting against Daenerys, it could have been a compelling mirror of her father's past betrayals, but rather than let that paranoia build slowly over multiple betrayals, slights, and secrets, the show compresses the arc into 2 episodes. She burns Varys alive, and then the matter is dropped. Varys' death should have been a defining moment for Daenerys. It could have been the beginning of her fear-based rule. Instead, it just feels like one more step in her quick slide into being the bad guy. Tyrion, too, is reduced to a reactive character. His relationship with Daenerys has potential since she once trusted his counsel above all, but in Season 8 he spends most of his time looking confused and worried, offering no real resistance or influence. When he finally turns on her, it's too late, and too shallow. The advisors around Daenerys were once her balancing forces. The showrunners failed to use them to slow her descent, leaving the audience with no one to argue against her choices in a meaningful way. At its best, Game of Thrones was a character-driven drama. Each decision, betrayal, and victory came from character logic, not plot convenience. But in the final season, the opposite occurred. The characters bent to fit an endpoint. The showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, admitted in interviews that they wanted to subvert expectations and reach a cinematic climax. They wanted Daenerys' fall to be shocking, but in their pursuit of surprise, they sacrificed depth. Compare this to earlier seasons. When Robb Stark was killed at the Red Wedding, it was shocking, but completely logical. He broke a marriage pact, alienated powerful houses, and underestimated his enemies. His death hurt, but made sense. As for Daenerys' downfall, it skipped the steps. The logic that might have made it powerful was replaced by visual drama. It became aesthetic over arc. Daenerys' final act of mass murder, followed by delusions of a utopian empire, felt too similar to the mad woman trope we have seen in stories for decades. This trope is often used when powerful women are portrayed as emotionally unstable, irrational, and dangerous when given authority. In Daenerys' case, her madness is treated like an inheritance, something inevitable because her father, the Mad King, also burned people alive. But Game of Thrones spent 7 seasons showing that she was not her father. She questioned herself, surrounded herself with morally grounded advisors, freed thousands, and was aware of her dark impulses and often restrained them. So when the show throws all of that out the window, painting her as a cold-eyed tyrant who just snaps, it feels reductive. This is especially frustrating for female fans who saw Daenerys as a rare example of a woman who rose to power without compromising her ideals until the writers decided otherwise, without meaningful character exploration. Meanwhile, George R.R. Martin, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, has remained mostly silent on how the books will handle Daenerys' arc. However, it is known that he gave the showrunners major plot points, including who ends up on the throne. Of course, Daenerys turning into a tyrant may well be part of Martin's vision, but here's the key difference. In the books, there will be time. Let's imagine an alternate story where Daenerys arrives in Westeros and is met with distrust. Her armies are seen as foreign invaders, the common folk are wary. Cersei spreads rumors that she is no different from her father. She tries to win people over but fails. Her closest friends die, Jon pulls away, Tyrion makes a political blunder, and she begins to feel isolated. She starts relying on her dragons more because they're the only ones who obey her. She starts seeing resistance as betrayal. She punishes the guilty, but her definition of guilty begins to shift. By the time she gets to King's Landing, she's convinced herself that burning it will free people from tyranny forever, and she believes only she can do it. Now that's a tragic, heartbreaking fall. Daenerys Targaryen's story was always going to end in fire, but it didn't have to end in confusion. The tragedy of her arc isn't that she became a villain, it's that her transformation was poorly written and detached from everything we were told to believe about her.